any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL News.
For this episode's TEFL News, we're going to be talking about a debate. It's another debate review, this time in ELT Journal. And this was initiated by Peter Majesh, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Okay.
So this is in the point and counterpoint section of the journal, and it was published this year. It's between Majesh and Amos Parens.
Okay.
And the topic is the relevance or irrelevance of academic research for the language teacher. So I'm going to summarize the 3 articles and then just get your opinions on each one in turn.
Okay.
And then we can decide who won this pugilistic matchup. So the first article is from Peter Majesh, and he argues that academic research is basically irrelevant for language teachers. He quotes a study by Simon Borg stating that only 15.6% of participants in a particular study regularly read research. This was teachers. A third never did, and 50% said sometimes, which probably means no. Okay? And Majesh asks, reasonably I think, if nobody's reading research, why bother doing it? He says that researchers are a bit like someone trying to help an old person across the street when the old person didn't actually want to go across the street in terms of their relationship to teachers. They're trying to help teachers when, in his opinion, teachers don't need any help, basically. So he argues that research and teaching move along fundamentally different paths. So teachers have to work in the moment and focus on the particular of what's happening in the classroom, whereas researchers work on projects for a long time and they're trying to find general principles. Okay, so these are fundamentally different activities according to this article. He also says that in applied linguistics there are a lot of different sub-disciplines like discourse analysis or pragmatics, second language acquisition, and that none of these are really talking to each other. So it's difficult for anyone to come to a kind of a broad understanding of advances in the field to what's the word? Put all those together. Synthesize, yes, that's the word. He also says that research can be confusing for teachers because new theories are very different from previous ones, and often researchers of similarly high ranking completely disagree with each other about their ideas for how to teach best. And he talks about this, he uses the analogy of dietary advice. So he says, every day in the newspaper you read a new bit of advice about what you should be eating, and it all seems to contradict everything else. And he says for a lot of teachers, that's how academic research feels. Things come out and everything seems to go in different directions. He argues that in terms of research, and in terms of the influence of research on teaching, there's been change rather than progress. So instead of things getting better, they just become different, right? And maybe, I think this is kind of an interesting point. He says that researchers need teachers more than teachers need researchers. So he's arguing that the teacher-researcher relationship is kind of a parasitic one, where the researcher needs to advance professionally, so they do research, and they need teachers in terms of carrying out their research, and they need to sell things to teachers, but teachers don't need researchers. Okay? And finally, he talks a little bit about teacher researchers and reflective practitioners. He's a little bit dismissive of those ideas as well. But basically, he argues at the end of the article that for most teachers, it's more important to rely on their own experiences and their own intuitions and the voice of their fellow teachers rather than on researchers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's his basic argument. I've summarised it there quite quickly.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
What about like the social aspect of research?
Okay.
Like teachers do research, right?
Yeah.
They're not two separate things.
So he does talk about that. He talks about teacher researchers, but he says that the job of teachers is to teach. It's to make sure that students learn. Their job isn't to create or produce public knowledge about what they're doing.
So,
And he also says that very few teachers actually do teacher research, and the ones that do usually end up getting hijacked by academia.
okay.
Right.
So what about teachers that do research for professional development?
Mm-hmm.
Because that would arguably be one reason, which he sort of hasn't really talked about there.
Well, he does mention reflective practitioners, and he thinks it's not a very good label because he says action without reflection is impossible. And therefore all teachers are, by definition, reflective practitioners.
Right.
So by being a teacher, you are being a reflective practitioner. Now,
Right. I think that's always been acknowledged. The point is just to what degree that's kind of formalized.
Right.
Yeah.
Same with like action research.
Yeah. What do you think?
So I don't know, like a couple of, I mean, the point about researchers need teachers more than teachers need researchers seems almost too obvious to mention.
Right.
Like researchers need something to research about. Like
Yeah.
if the field didn't exist, obviously there'd be nothing to research.
Right.
The other thing about how he's talking about the industry or the field changing but not necessarily improving, kind of perhaps hints at the like contradicts his main point, which is that I mean it seems like all this research is having some effect on the way people teach.
Right.
Okay, maybe it's not an improvement, but maybe it is having an effect. I mean, what I imagine, or one possible argument against this would be that there may not be an obvious immediate effect of the research that's being done, but that eventually it kind of trickles down and engenders some kind of changes within how languages are taught.
Right. So he does talk a little bit about mediators and the role of mediators, but he says that also mediators have not had a great impact on the field. And he says that when teachers do things like professional development, they read research and they read books and things to gain qualifications. But he says it's like water off a duck's back, because as soon as they have gained their qualification, they just go back to doing whatever they did before.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, but he would acknowledge that method, like there have been changes in language teaching over the years.
I think,
Not necessarily. I mean, that's another interesting argument. We probably the context that we work in are the ones where we're more likely to read academic research papers than the vast majority of language teachers in the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, you read these things about how most language teachers are probably working in secondary education around the world, and maybe for them maybe it is irrelevant.
Yeah, I guess that's his background, because I think he was originally a teacher and then moved into academia.
Like, I think all teachers have beliefs, right? And the whole field of like teacher cognition and the way that teachers think about like methodologies, for example, they all need to come from somewhere.
Right.
And they all need to be underpinned.
Yeah.
And that's why I think teachers need researchers or research. They need to. It's like any other profession. It's like journalism. You can't be a journalist without the facts. Well, a lot of people can.
I would argue maybe they don't need it.
Bad example.
Yeah, I'd argue maybe they don't need the research, but that it can be informative for teachers in certain contexts.
Yeah.
I think even secondary school teachers in wherever, probably the style of teaching, the methodology has been influenced by general trends in language teaching.
Right. So I think in terms of the point that you mentioned about researchers obviously they need something to research.
Yeah.
He does mention something about how it's always framed in this kind of top-down way.
Yeah.
So it's not just researchers saying we're going to see what you're doing. It's
right.
We're going to tell you what to do.
Yeah. And I think that angle of criticism is much more valid than just saying it's irrelevant.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So we've got some ideas on that. Let's look at the response from Amos Parens. So he argues against it. His article is called "Only Connect: Researchers and Teachers in Dialogue," and he says that relying on intuition and received wisdom is a vicious circle. And he also asked the questions, I think, again, reasonable questions. Whose experience do we rely on? And how do we evaluate the experiences of others without any kind of objective criteria, which would come from, research potentially? He says that intuition often leads us to incorrect conclusions, and that we need independent observation and measurement to find out if our intuitions are correct. Okay, if you just rely on your intuitions, then that's the vicious circle. He also talks about cognitive biases that teachers have. So you mentioned before teacher beliefs. So he talks about things like the halo effect, where, for example, when someone's marking a test, if they give the first answer a high mark, they're more likely to give the rest of the answers a high mark, right? So your intuition might lead you astray, or your cognitive biases might lead you astray. And he says that while, of course, intuition and experience are important, teachers need to look at data and evidence to inform their decision-making, right? In terms of the actual nature of research itself, the point that Majesh makes about the research seeming to contradict itself, Parens says that that's actually evidence of research being self-correcting, right? The fact that new findings can come in and show that older ones may not be correct. So he says that's actually a bonus of research. And he then goes on to give lots of examples of classroom practices which are underpinned by a lot of research. So the first one that he mentions is extensive reading. Not just that extensive reading is good, but he shows that there's been long-term and quite painstaking research about things like what learners should read. Should they read at their level or beyond their level? What should they do with their reading? And should they be tested on their reading, right? And he says that some of these research claims are actually counterintuitive, so things that you wouldn't intuit as a teacher. For example, there's research that shows that reading at a lower level than your current level actually produces better effects on your reading proficiency than reading at your level or at a higher level, right?
Would he argue that maybe so the current research thinking around extensive reading says that, but next year there might be another research that comes out and says, actually reading below your level is really bad for your
right. Yeah, well, I guess that is a counter-argument. That's not what Majesh says in his replies to this, which we'll get to in a little bit. Right. But Parens also, he gives some other examples. So he says narrow reading for vocabulary development. There's been research showing, the effectiveness of that. Research shows that getting from context is not useful, whereas a lot of teachers think that it is useful. Research against teaching lexical sets, or certain types of lexical sets. The benefits of using L1 translations, the benefits of pre-task planning, giving less feedback on writing rather than more, like a lot of beginning teachers will correct every mistake, but research shows that actually that's not the most helpful thing. So he says there are actually lots of things that people do in the classroom which are underpinned by, very, very good, robust research results. Yeah.
So all of these research findings are quite nuanced, and so our learners are also like that too. So what I'm wondering is, in like an isolated, take one school in isolation. If they had no access to research, but they were still getting the outcomes that they wanted, would research matter?
Well, I guess that's Majesh's question, right? I think that's what he thinks.
But then through their initial teacher training, they would have already been informed by the research anyway.
Right.
What came first, the researcher or the teacher?
Yeah.
So I guess there's two kind of angles on that again. So one is that maybe all this research is being done, but it's not being read by teachers.
Yeah.
So maybe there is great research being done, and it produces these clear implications for how language should be taught, but the people who are teaching the language aren't actually reading and taking in that research.
Right.
Is one thing. And the other is that maybe, like he was talking about the dietary fads and stuff. It's kind of the point I made earlier, but that's all, you could say this is very good research and robust research and has all these conclusions, but you may get contradictory results the next time that research is done.
Right. Yeah. So, the point about the kind of communication, that's what Parens ends with. So he argues, as you said actually about initial teacher training, that research does influence practice by informing initial teacher education, by underpinning the materials that are sold to teachers to use in classrooms, in CPD, continuing professional development, through teacher research, and also, he says, increasingly in special practical sections of journals. So a lot of journals now include, special sections that are meant to be practical that teachers can implement in the classroom. And he argues that the blame shouldn't be placed just on the researchers. He says the blame should be placed on both researchers and teachers for failing to maintain a dialogue. So it's not just the researchers' fault for not communicating properly, it's also the teacher's fault for not, trying to read the research. And he says that the profession, was his kind of concluding point, is that the profession should enable more channels of meaningful communication between the two. More of, like if you look at the magazines like English Teaching Professional, Modern English Teacher, there are very rarely big research names writing in those, and it would benefit, I think, if people actually did summarise their own research in those places and say what the practical applications of it were. But, you don't get professional kudos for doing that, really.
Yeah.
Do you also think that like school managers or directors of studies play a part in making their employees read about this research?
I mean, yeah, we try to connect teachers to the research as much as possible, or encourage that kind of connection.
Well, maybe we'll just finish by looking at Majesh's reply to Parens' reply, the counterpoint. So he agrees with Parens that evidence is, in general, more reliable than intuitions, but he questions whether researchers are actually capable of providing real evidence. So he looks at some of the sources that Parens cites, and he notes that he looks at one source in particular, and he says, this source actually doesn't make any claims for evidence, and that the research produced circumstantial evidence at best, not conclusive evidence. And so he argues that the vicious circle that Parens talks about can't be broken because research is no more reliable than received wisdom and intuition, in fact. Which I guess is a very arguable point.
Right.
He then looks at, or he mentions the classroom practices that Parens says are underlain by research or that have come out of research, and he says these are no big discoveries, are they? And he says that good teachers have been doing this all along. I don't know. I think that slightly misses some of the point, because Parens' point was some of this is counterintuitive, and teachers, don't do this, or they do something else. Also, he argues that Parens takes this top-down approach, positioning the work of the researcher above the experience of the teacher, kind of a condescending relationship. And he argues that language-related research is not useless. He's a researcher himself, he says language-related research is not a useless thing to be doing. He's only saying that it offers very little for the language teacher. That's his kind of final line. So, what do you think? Who do you agree with more? Who won? Who won the fight?
Well, I was going to say, does anyone actually know that this conversation's actually going on?
Anybody's reading it.
If our teachers actually,
Right.
I guess we're part of this. I think we're getting it out there, aren't we?
Yeah.
Podcasting is another. No, it's not that.
I mean, it
But
could,
do you know what I mean?
be.
Do you know what I mean? We are talking about this and getting it out there. And we are predominantly teachers.
So is Majestys' point that more teachers should be reading the research, that there should be better research, that the research should be made more relevant to teachers?
He's saying that the research is irrelevant because it doesn't tell us anything. Well, it doesn't tell us anything conclusively, and it also it doesn't tell us anything we don't already know. Like that good teachers don't already know. I believe would be a fair summary.
But so is he therefore calling for a stop on this kind of research?
He doesn't actually call for anything in particular.
Yeah,
he doesn't make that kind of position call. What he's saying that this research is irrelevant, and that teachers can get on with what they're doing without worrying about the academic research. I think actually what he's more interested in is teachers as inquirers, teachers, kind of sharing their stories a little bit more, rather than, formalised academic research.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so that's this episode's TEFL news, the debate over the relevance or irrelevance of research in ELT journal.
TEFL Cultures.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Culture, I'd like to discuss with you both the use of textbooks
Yeah,
in
I
the
like
classroom.
in your notes you've written textbooks in speech marks, like so-called textbooks.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe we'll get on to that, yeah. I don't think we've ever covered this on the show, textbooks. We talked to John Coleman about a critical eye over textbooks.
Mhm, yeah.
But I don't think we've actually talked about textbooks' use or lack of use in the classroom.
Right.
So I thought we'd talk about that.
Sure.
A little bit about, and I want you both to think about your history with textbooks as well, or
Okay.
course books. I'm not quite sure. Well, maybe we'll talk about the difference there too as well.
Okay, yeah.
So I've had a lot of different experiences with textbooks over the years. When I first started teaching at a private language school, the course was the textbook.
Right.
So the course was there was no, you did this lesson this day, next lesson this day. The students were sold the textbook, and you were kind of expected to get through the textbook, and there was no wiggle room. That was it.
Right.
So that was my first experience with textbooks, and at the time I didn't really have a problem with that because I hadn't really seen the other side. That was just how things were done.
Yeah.
And I was quite happy with that. In my next job, where I met Rob before that, but we started working more closely together. We took an approach where we didn't use any textbooks. Like we were given our own course, and I'm not sure if we did this deliberately, but we decided to just start making our own materials. And we felt that no textbooks would fit what we wanted to do.
We did try and use textbooks initially, and then we found it didn't really work. Like the students didn't like it, and it didn't fit in with anything.
Yeah, but I'd say like 80% of the time we were making our own materials and giving ourselves a lot more work. And and then in my next job, I found kind of a happy medium. I found I could use textbooks, but I was back to having some kind of conditions placed upon me, but I could also see how to work and manipulate textbooks and pick and choose. And I also learned how much work goes into textbooks as well, and the editing process and writing process, which is something I hadn't considered before. And I now come to my current job where I'm going back to textbooks again, and I feel confident that I could do something with it, but I don't have complete confidence in the book that I'm going to be teaching from.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of my kind of potted history of textbook use in the class. What's been your experiences?
Well, so I started out in the same job as you. In fact, my first two jobs are the same as your first two jobs, pretty much. So yeah, using...
In fact, 3 of these have been in the same, but yeah, not anymore.
No. So my first job was all textbooks, just using textbooks, but they were textbooks produced by the school, which basically meant they were like sort of crap rip-offs of like real textbooks. The second job, we made our own course. And actually, I enjoyed that a lot more. I enjoyed having our own course, being able to change it and do whatever we wanted with it, and tailor it to what the students needed, which was useful. My third job after that had a textbook, but the teaching approach was very sort of top-down, pre-designed. There wasn't much deviation allowed, and the textbook essentially, prescribed that teaching approach. So, having the textbook or not having the textbook wouldn't have made that much difference, to be honest, because the teaching approach was the textbook, and the textbook was based on the teaching approach. In my current job, I don't use any textbooks at all, because I don't have to teach that many classes, so I have the time to sit and develop the materials myself. And I enjoy doing that as well, although sometimes I look at established textbooks and rip them off, because, who's gonna stop me? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
My very first, well, not quite, but my more or less first real teaching job had no textbooks. It was all one-to-one. Kind of, and there were no textbooks at all. But then the 10 years after that was all with textbooks, like heavily based on textbooks. Either because I wasn't really sure how to make my own materials, or because I had to use the textbooks because of where I was working. but I grew to hate every textbook I ever
Okay.
used.
Maybe
basically.
we can talk about that later on.
Yeah. And then I was in a position where I had a textbook, but I didn't really have to use it, and I could kind of do what I wanted with it, or not use it. And where I currently am, I'm part of. I help write our in-house textbook, which is part of a strongly unified curriculum where basically everybody has to use the book in order. So I don't. I'm okay using the book because I've been able to kind of have a hand in writing every, make decisions about what's on every page of it. And I actually don't use the book that much in terms of asking students, okay, now open your page to this book. But the target language and the topics are all there, which I follow. I don't know. I found, like, maybe like your experience with now ripping off other textbooks. Like even when somebody, like a friend would like say, oh, here's a lesson I made, and like give me some handouts, and I tried to use it, it never worked. So I think even if you just take it as a soft copy and go through and make changes or adapt it in your own way, it works a lot better than just like taking somebody else. And it's the same with textbooks.
I was going to say, like, when I taught at the British Council, I had to use books like Business Result and Market Leader and things like that. And I think actually honestly, I've never had a completely satisfactory lesson using a textbook. Whereas I have, like, not a perfect lesson, but I've had a very satisfactory lessons using my own materials.
I think probably one idea is every textbook that's published should make available an editable, online version.
Right.
So even if it's just making small changes, adding prompts, taking away prompts, changing the wording, something I think would probably make it a lot more usable.
There's a book I'm using now in another course I'm teaching where they give you a PowerPoint version of the textbook, and that's great because that's my lesson. I take stuff out, I edit stuff, and the students have it in front of them. They just turn the page and it's there. And so I think that's one way to do it. I thought today we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of textbooks, and I've written 4 for each, and I'm sure there are many more. So feel free to add some. I'd say one advantage is that mass-produced textbooks, they've been edited, they've been reviewed, and they've gone through a certain degree of quality control. So I think in terms of the language used and the activities have been tested, I think that's arguably an advantage. We know the materials work to some extent.
I don't know how quality controlled are textbooks and how much of it is based on just the author's kind of say so. And I mean, a lot of them seem to be organised along the same lines, like. You've got a bit of language, and you've got a sort of theme, and you do some activities based on that. I mean, that it all seems sort of quite.
Yeah, and also I think the more mass market it is, the more general they want to make it. And so obviously I think the big publishers they get feedback from teachers and that kind of thing.
That's what I mean.
But I don't really know.
I mean, one example. Think about Let's Go. I mean, they've got a series of authors that work on that, a group of authors, and it's been very successful over a long amount of time.
But something being successful, I mean, I've never used Let's Go, I'm not talking about that specifically, but something being very successful doesn't necessarily mean it's very good.
Right, it might be user-friendly.
Yeah, and it might just, I mean, some things can just pick up so much momentum that it's impossible to stop,
Yeah, I mean, I think having said that, I think there are, some books are obviously better than others.
Of course,
and even books which more or less look the same, like those books that have the grammar and the topic and all that kind of stuff laid out, which is most of them. But I used to cycle in a school I worked for in London. We used to cycle through the same 3 textbooks. So I would teach Headway for 12 weeks. I would teach face-to-face for 12 weeks, and then cutting edge for 12 weeks. So, and I did that several times.
Right.
And I definitely had favorites. There was some I preferred to others. I don't know if it's about the layout or even just like the what the textbook writer was doing kind of fit my style or fit my wording or whatever.
Right.
Well, that's the thing, the textbook writer. So I think like the materials, they come from maybe what's worked well for a writer, and they're now making it, they're formalising it a bit more, arguably.
We're back to intuition and receivers.
The second one is they operate as a kind of a crutch in the class. something to hang a lesson around or plan lessons around. You know, we might not use everything religiously, but we can pick and choose. And it gives us an idea and that kind of thing, especially in a business context. Like I've said before, when I interviewed Mike and Chia, I don't feel confident teaching business English. Yeah. But I need that book to kind of act as a support.
Yeah, I mean, when I was teaching business, the problem was I didn't know that much about business, and I still don't. And I felt that the book didn't know that much either in terms of what the students wanted. Like for them, it all seemed really irrelevant. Like most students who came for business classes were like, well, I'm a salesperson, I don't need to know about any of this stuff, you know. So I don't know. I think business is a very just broad thing that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure those particular types of books have been developed based on needs analysis. But then whose your needs are different to someone else's needs. You know?
Yeah,
so
exactly. It's like business encompasses 1,000 different jobs which have 1,000 different needs, and
another advantage I have is they provide learners with a bit of direction and maybe a source of motivation. Getting through the course book, the textbook,
slogging through to the finishing line.
It's a kind of a very visual aid of visual indicator of development, maybe.
Yeah, I think some learners will make notes in their book and they'll reread the glossaries in the back and all that kind of stuff.
But I think you could do the same. Like with my courses, I give the students a course plan at the beginning. And they know exactly what's going to be happening week by week, and what they're going to be learning. So that would give them the same thing, right? They just go through and check it off, or whatever.
Yeah, but I mean like a book where they they'll go back and look at previous things. It's in one package.
I suppose.
Another advantage is textbooks can be good in ESP contexts to some extent. One example is in the place that I work, we have hospitality English, and there's a textbook dedicated just to hospitality English, the type of language used in, not hospitals, the type of language used in hotels and that kind of, in restaurants and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think, there is a niche market for those kind of textbooks. As a textbook
I don't know. Perhaps. I don't know if the advantages are necessarily that much greater in those contexts than for other contexts.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think just think about the alternative.
Yeah.
I think if the alternative was whoever's teaching that course knows that special purpose well enough to create their own materials, that would still be preferable.
Yeah.
Do you have any other advantages that you can think of for textbooks?
They make a lot of money for schools and authors.
Yeah.
I honestly, I don't like textbooks very much, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And I feel I should be honest to our listeners.
Yeah.
You haven't up to this.
I guess for less experienced teachers who, as a way to get to the point where they can design their own materials, maybe it's useful for them. But I agree, as soon as possible, in most contexts, it's preferable if teachers are creating their own materials.
Yeah. I guess you could also say for a lot of teachers, they're underpaid and overworked, and it's not really reasonable to ask them to create their own materials. Because why should they?
Yeah.
What's the difference between a teacher sharing their materials and a teacher sharing their research? Is there a difference? Because at some point you're going to want to tell others, here's a great thing that I did.
Yeah. Well, we're going back to the first discussion.
Yeah. I mean, at some point teachers want to reach out to others, right?
Yeah.
And I think materials and research are two forms of that.
Well, that's basically what Majesh said in his article, that teachers should be out there sharing their voices and their stories and their experiences, but not necessarily formalised research.
Could his kind of argument not be applied to materials writers? Do teachers need materials? Do materials writers need teachers?
Well, that's the discussion we're having, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think they do, yeah. Do materials writers need teachers more than teachers need materials writers?
Yeah. Or then the other question is, do materials writers need the research to inform how they write the materials?
See, so that's why I think that's another advantage of textbooks, that often, or to some extent, they are underpinned by research.
That's what Parens said in his article.
I mean, as I said, I'm involved in writing a textbook, and when me and the three other editors, are, like when we come to a point where we can't make a decision about something, we will try to find the research to inform that decision.
You'll find something that confirms your preconceptions.
Well, no, it's usually like we can't agree.
Okay,
Yeah,
fair enough.
so then we have to go and find out. But obviously there's going to be research which would support either side.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. We're already kind of on the disadvantages. So
It's very easy to get to.
let's just briefly go through these. They go out of date quickly, particularly images used in the book and anecdotes used, even some of the target language examples.
And also some of the social norms that are used.
Yeah. For example.
Well, for example, there was some talk of like heteronormativity in textbooks, things like that. Yeah.
Like the whole lingua franca paradigm.
I guess.
Representations of British English and that kind of thing.
I think some textbooks can address that in certain ways.
I think, so my next point is other types of language learning materials are becoming more prominent, such as smartphone applications, online platforms, and also kind of textbooks to an extent are being extended beyond just the book. They have their online accompaniments and that kind of thing.
Yeah. What about Jeff Jordan's complaint about textbooks, that they're based on an incorrect or a model of second language acquisition that's contradicted by the best research? What about that? In terms of they sequence language in a kind of synthetic way, and that isn't, from what research tells us, that isn't the way that people learn languages, by having pre-selected target language taught to them in a...
So for textbooks that are doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But again, textbooks don't have to do that.
Right.
Not all of them do.
Yeah.
Another point I made, it's not always clear what the audience is or what the intended use of the textbook is. Often when you pick up a textbook, you don't really know what the author's intention was a lot of the time.
Right.
I find.
Death of the author.
Yeah. Even though there's
Authorial intent.
even though there's instructions, sometimes it's not really clear just by looking at the design of a book. What am I supposed to do with this, or how was
That's
it?
That's where the
intended?
teacher's guide comes in.
Yeah, never read those.
Nobody needs to.
That's another. Yeah.
But sometimes I feel like just the design of books can be a bit off-putting. Like the pages can be really busy, and it's meant to be attractive to students, but it just looks cluttered. And sort of difficult to get a handle on.
I mean, I guess I'm not sure if it's Jeff Jordan himself or somebody writing on his blog on the topic, or who it was, maybe somebody else, but advocating that, if there is a textbook created, it should be created locally.
Right.
It should be, for a specific context.
I think Jeff Jordan and people on his blog argue for materials banks.
Yeah.
Worksheet cupboards.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to go.
That A4 folder in the corner.
I think but ultimately it comes down to how well the teacher kind of uses, rather than letting the textbook teach the class. You sometimes teach through it, you teach around it, you use parts of it.
That's fair.
I think that's a skill. That's a skill,
And I'm sure there are places where the two teachers are both using the same book and going through the book from beginning to the end. And in one class, the students think this is a great class, and the other think this is terrible.
Right. Yeah. I think basically, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with the materials in a textbook, but it is this idea of it being this mandated thing that you have to get through, slogging through.
If that's how you approach it, yeah.
But I mean, that's how a lot of schools approach it.
Sure.
You have to do this.
Yeah.
And I don't like that. I don't think that's a good way to do things.
Yeah, and it encourages like Thornbury's idea of covering grammar.
Right.
Okay, we've covered that. Now let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's textbooks.
We've solved that.
Now turn to page. No. That's textbooks.
TEFL Pioneers.
For this episode's TEFL Pioneer, we're going to discuss or talk about Monsieur. I'm gonna butcher the name. It's a French name. Lambert Sauveur.
Lambert Sauveur.
Lambert.
Lambert Sauveur.
We can call him Lambert for the rest of it. Sauveur.
Sauveur. Okay.
So as you can guess, he's French.
Right.
He was born in France in 1826, but he lived and worked a lot in Belgium.
Okay.
During his early years. He then emigrated to the United States of America in the 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to run through some biographical data, obviously. So At some point, he met Herr Gottlieb Hennis.
Okay. I don't know who that is.
Right. Who had worked with a Johann Pestalozzi, a Swissman.
I'm sure I've heard these names around.
Yeah, I think these names have been around. So Pestalozzi basically promoted a much more gentle approach to language teaching than was common at the time.
Right.
And that's maybe important to keep in mind.
What do you mean gentle?
Gentle, I think, like less...
direct? The
yeah.
direct method was quite important.
Yeah, okay. Less... like, I guess, not focusing so much on students just memorizing facts and drilling them on those kind of things.
Right,
Yeah.
I see.
But this Gottlieb Hennis had tried out a lot of Pestalozzi's ideas in Germany, and then moved in German too. He probably was being German. And then moved to the US to open a language school to teach German and to apply these methods that he had been trying out. Sauveur, I'm not sure if he met Sauveur in the States or in Europe, but he hired Lambert Sauveur to be the French teacher at the school.
Okay.
It's a school in Boston, opened in 1869.
Right.
So Sauveur, he wrote about his methods, so I'll just quote him a couple times. He says, our system consists of learning to speak a living language without the aid of grammar and without a single word of English being spoken.
Ah.
The teaching of French
Right.
or German. So in other words, no L1 at all.
Okay.
He says, one must always proceed from the known to the unknown, making the new words understood by using ones that the student has already acquired.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. This is I+1.
Yeah, I think this known to the unknown idea came from Pestalozzi. And that when I first read that, I thought that sounds kind of obvious, like you. Yeah, but I guess the idea here is it's L2 only, target language only, and you slowly build up their awareness.
Okay.
Okay.
So he decided all of this could be achieved through conversation.
Okay.
So that was his method of teaching, conversations with his students. He wrote a textbook. You'll not be pleased
They
to
all
know.
do eventually. Yeah, we all do eventually.
But this is not a textbook that we would recognize in the structure. So it was called
Learning with Lambert.
so the book was called Causeries avec mes élèves. Basically means chats with my students. So it was 200 pages of conversations between Sauveur and his students, but imaginary conversations.
Right, I was going to say, it was transcriptions.
It wasn't transcriptions. He basically imagined what questions his students might ask him.
Right.
So he created these. It kind of made me think, like, why not, like, have real conversations with students? And maybe a lot of it was based on real conversations.
Is it a bit like when we talked about the medieval guy who taught Latin, and he had those dialogues with the plough herd and stuff, the farmer, a bit like that.
It's kind of similar. I mean, it's meant to be kind of a friendly tone, and he uses the word chats.
Right.
It
It doesn't involve beating the students like the other guy did.
No.
Do you think these actually came as a result of the conversations he had, or do you think these were kind of idealised conversations he'd like to have?
I think kind of idealized. It seems like he imagined what students might say, but
Yeah.
I don't think he named the students necessarily.
Right.
So here's an example. This is from the first part of lesson 7. I'm not sure what the lesson's about exactly, but it's lesson 7. I'll read it out a little bit. So it's not written like as a script. It's written as a series of lines, and they're just distinguishable by some are italicized and some aren't.
Right.
So they're talking about food. So somebody says, the meals are so important for conversation. And this is obviously an English translation of the original text. So the first person says, the meals are so important for conversation. There is no conversation at the table, monsieur. Excuse me, my friend, in France we speak a lot at the table. We enjoy the conversation more than the food. Do you speak French at the table? Of course, we speak only French, etc.
Right. Okay.
So it's meant to be casual. It doesn't sound very natural, but maybe I'm just not selling it well. No.
I wasn't sure which the two characters were.
Right.
What your motivation was. It was
Right.
unclear.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So one is a student speaking to the teacher, right?
Yeah.
And the student is saying, but we don't speak at the table.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he's saying,
How about in
sod
France we
that,
do?
just-
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's including
Right.
cultural values as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay.
It seems like he's
Yeah.
explaining things about French culture.
And topics of interest to talk about, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So each lesson lasted 2 hours,
Right.
apparently. I'll talk a little bit more about how he thought the lessons should be structured. In the first lesson, actually, the textbook wasn't used at all. But he claimed that in the first 2 hour lesson, the students learned over 100 words. I'm not sure which 100, but 100 words just through demonstration and question and answer.
Right.
That kind of reminds me of like the silent way,
Right.
where the idea is like you don't provide any materials, you just slowly build up. You say, okay, pen, a pen, you like
This
engage
is a
with them
pen,
like that.
and then you're a language teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah, I doubt they learnt 100 words in 2 hours.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he means by learned, but
They didn't acquire them.
They didn't acquire them.
I've studied them.
He gave them
Yeah.
100 words.
Yeah.
but as part of that, even that in that first lesson, he would encourage them to ask questions about what was happening.
Okay.
That was the method. And actually, the textbook was made up of all these chats, imaginary chats. But the idea was, before using the textbook, the students, before they even looked at these imaginary discussions, they would have had similar chats in the classroom a lot. So these chats were meant as reinforcement rather than a way to present the new language.
Okay.
Which, yeah,
Like
seems like it's,
idealized versions of what they've said.
yeah, I suppose so. But it seems like that's not how it's usually done the other way around now.
Yeah.
You would present examples of the language first, and then have students practice it. But it seems like they were doing it the other way around. They were practicing it, and then and so here's as a reinforcement. Here's a way that this language could be used.
Interesting.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that he was also reacting to what was happening in the classroom as well? Because I've seen this is quite a recent thing to do, to write what's happened in the lesson as a kind of a formative feedback of the class. And that seems like what he's doing. He's
Right.
just formatively writing it all up as
But for the benefit of the students.
yeah. Here's
Yeah.
what we did. Here's everything encompassed in this conversation.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I mean, it's kind of it's interesting because usually people present a dialogue first, then try and get the students to do it themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
But in this case, it's the opposite of that. It's that backwards.
Yeah.
Which I quite like as an idea actually.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean nowadays, I guess a lot of importance is put on input as a precursor to output.
Right.
But I guess, I mean, I imagine he would argue, or he probably wouldn't argue it in these terms, but the input comes from him.
Right.
And then, but it's almost like input output at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. So I haven't seen the actual book, but the early chapters, it starts with kind of very concrete stuff. So the first 3 chapters are different parts of the body. Chapter 5 is just called hair.
Okay.
By chapter 27, the topic is God.
All right. Wow. So quite the progression.
But then chapter 28 is the cricket,
Okay.
as in the insect.
All right.
Oh, okay.
However, the cricket, apparently tells a story or a chat about a cricket who is jealous of a butterfly.
Right.
And then-
because of the hair.
It's Aesop's cricket.
Well, the
Is that
the cricket then contemplates suicide.
Okay. Well, there were a lot of parsnips in this book. We got God, we got suicide,
Yeah, hair.
hair. Yes.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, when they would look at this material, would say, how do I use this, or what is this? But Sauveur, he was quite explicit that, he said the textbook was meant to be used by, quote, attentive and intelligent teachers. So no dummies allowed
Right.
using his book. And then the book should be used as a guide, basically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe not a very prescriptive textbook of the variety we were just talking about in that section.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he suggested actually that basically they use it for homework, so
Right.
that the students could read the conversation book for homework, and then during the lesson they would ask questions about the conversations, he would read out excerpts, etc. But crucially all in French,
Right.
which was...
So
new
why are
for
you
the
talking
time.
about it on the TEFLology podcast?
I wonder
It's
how.
a TEFLology podcast.
So you go going from the known to the unknown. I wonder how the dialogues progressed in terms of like the grading of language. And
Yeah.
how much the language was repeated.
So yeah, I wonder about
What
that
does
too.
the first one look like? You know.
Right, right.
the first
And I
one.
wonder maybe he was going against all the robust research that we have now to embed new language within the context of known language,
Right.
and hope that students would
Yeah.
understand from the context.
Well, it seems to work. If there were only 100 words every 2 hours, then
Yeah,
pretty effective.
That's true. So actually, grammar and translation were allowed, but only at the higher levels. He wrote a book on grammar, but again, it was structured around imaginary conversations with students.
Right.
He would have a grammar point and then imagine the types of questions his students would ask him.
I think he ever actually spoke to a student. Just imagined. Was he actually a teacher? Just
He's a fantasist.
conjured all this
Notes
up.
from an asylum.
Yes, but the reason he structured the book on grammar around this is that what he noticed is that grammar was something that was usually memorized. I think this is maybe going back to Pestalozzi's influence. Basically, he said often memorized but rarely understood.
Right.
And so he wanted to reverse that. I guess he didn't care too much about just memorizing it.
Yeah.
Only.
I sometimes wonder about that, like how important is it to fully understand grammar? It's the same with vocabulary, especially like idioms and things like that.
Yeah.
You could explain to a student the etymology of something in a way that would make them understand why that word is used to express that concept.
Yeah.
But do they need to know that? Because most people just learn that the relationship between that and that, and then they're okay.
Yeah.
So do you need to know? Do you need to understand it, or just to be able to use it?
Yeah. If you know that pattern that performs what you want it to perform.
Yeah, strengths.
So at the time he was considered one of the people like most responsible for the success of the natural method. However, he always gave credit to Hennis, for who he claimed created the natural method.
Right.
He also referenced Montaigne, the Frenchman, writer,
Yeah.
philosopher guy, apparently whose father hired a German who didn't speak French, which Montaigne only spoke, to be his Latin tutor.
Right.
So everything had to be in Latin, and also Socrates in terms of the question-answer method of learning. Their language school was very, very successful. However, they were eventually eclipsed by Berlitz, who was a contemporary.
Right.
And maybe that's one reason why they're not as well known as they might have been. And
Yeah.
then he died in 1907.
How did he die?
At the end.
Make up something.
I like you've written that in pen at the end of your notes.
Added it just to ease. Yeah.
Yeah.
How did he die? You don't know.
He actually fell down a well that they were constructing in the south side of Boston.
Do you think he found
that
out
true?
about his death through an imagined conversation with a student?
He was probably lost in an imaginary conversation. Didn't notice the open well.
Yeah.
So that's this episode's TEFL pioneer, Lambert Sauveur.
Thanks for listening to today's episode.
Don't forget, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. Like us on Facebook, that name again, TEFLology. And you can also visit our website, www.teflology-podcast.com, where you can find all of our previous episodes and much, much more. Actually, that's all there is.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, no, there's pictures of you guys.
Pictures of
There's
us.
a picture of you as well.
Really?
Yeah, I took one through the curtains.
And don't forget, please like and rate us. Or actually, no, like us on Facebook. But also rate us on iTunes.
Yeah.
or whatever
Or subscribe.
other thing you
Or
use.
subscribe. That's the more.
Well, no, and
you don't even
Yeah.
need to listen. Just subscribe. That's the important one. Okay, so it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.